Welcome back, everybody. The Pauper Metagame is here to break down another deck. Today we're going to talk about Affinity. Last week we talked about Elves. It's interesting because last week Elves was actually in the number 2 spot in the meta and Affinity was number 1, and now they've swapped spots, at least when you look at the numbers on the MTG Goldfish website, which is basically where most everybody goes to get data on this kind of stuff. The Pauper Metagame is interesting because right now the Pauper metagame is mostly online as far as the data. I mean, it's pretty much all online as far as the data goes. Right now, Channel Fireball is running some Pauper side events in paper, which is pretty exciting to see Pauper being played in the paper format. The Channel Fireball side events that play paper go by the same legality rules ban list as the online format. But those are 3 rounds Swiss, and it's hard to get any real meaningful data. Plus, I don't even know if it's published anywhere. So that means all of the information we get for Pauper comes from Magic Online. You've got to distinguish this a little bit from other formats like Modern, Standard, Legacy, even Vintage, where there's paper formats where you can get some data points. The only data points we have for Pauper online. This is also somewhat further complicated by the fact that Magic Online only produces a limited number of 5.0 deck lists. Instead of giving us all or even a wide selection, we actually only get a few. So anyway, what we're going to do today is we're going to break down Affinity and talk about some of its matchups. First of all, let's talk about the mana base. Darksteel Citadel is a 4-of, which is an indestructible artifact land that produces a colorless mana, is a pretty standard inclusion. Great Furnace, which is a artifact land that adds a red mana to your mana pool, 4-of, this is also pretty standard. Seed of the Synod, which adds blue to your mana pool, having this as a 4-of is also pretty standard. And then Tree of Tales, having 4 of these is also fairly standard. Now there's some affinity lists that will go ahead and throw in a couple more lands. I'm just going to pull up a few more random affinity lists here just to see if we can find some examples. Okay, so here's an example where somebody threw in an Ancient Den and they've got a Ray of Revelation in the sideboard. So there's stuff like that that you'll find from time to time where people will splash either the white or the black mana producing artifact land just to maybe get a 17th land, and sometimes because of some kind of particularized sideboard tech. Reaping the Graves is a card that I've seen in the past, don't see a whole lot right now. But it's a black and 2 colorless mana instant. Return target creature card from your graveyard to your hand, and it has Storm. So it's not too hard to pop this off during your opponent's turn when maybe you've stalled out and pull back 3 or 4 creatures to your hand if they play a couple of spells. And even if they counterspell one of your Storm copies, it doesn't matter, you're still going to get value. The reason I mentioned Reaping the Graves is because I've seen it occasionally as a sideboard card in some affinity lists, and while it's not necessary to actually add any black producing lands, because there's other things like Prophetic Prism and Springleaf Drum and Chromatic Star. These are all available options, but I just mention it because if instead of Ray of Revelation, if you want to splash instead of an Ancient Den into your list, if you want to go for 17 lands on an affinity list, then you can go white if you're thinking about Ray of Revelation, or black mana if you're thinking about Reaping the Graves for that 17th artifact land. Or if Reaping the Graves and Ray of Revelation aren't cards you really want to run in your sideboard, it doesn't really matter what you splash for your 17th land as long as it's an artifact land. So there's that. Or you may just decide to stick with 16 lands and go with that, which is fairly standard. I think there's probably more lists from Affinity running 16 than 17 land. But enough of the land. Let's move on to the creature package. Atog is the all-star here. Atog I imagine everybody's familiar with it, but it's a red mana and a colorless. It says sacrifice an artifact as an activated ability, and the ATOG will get +2/+2 until end of turn. It starts out as a 1/2 creature. So basically your whole deck is largely artifacts with a few other creatures and spells, but even some of your creatures are also artifacts like your Frogmites and your Mere Enforcers, along with your artifact lands and a host of other supplemental artifacts. It's not terribly difficult to get in a couple of points of damage, pump your ATOG by sacrificing 4 artifacts to turn it into a 9/11 creature, and then either fling it at your opponent for lethal after going in for combat damage, or team your battle raging your ATOG to hopefully go in for lethal, because fling, by the way, is just a red and a colorless that says you sacrifice your creature and then you deal damage to target creature or player equal to the power of the creature you just sacrificed. So basically, if you sacrifice an ATOG that has 20 power, you'll do 20 damage to your opponent. Teamer Battle Rage is a red and a colorless instant. Target creature gains double strike, and as long as that creature had at least 4 power, that creature also gets trample. So Teamer Battle Rage on a pumped up ATOG is pretty good unless they've got a fog or some spot removal. Anyway, so ATOG always poses those threats. The other thing about ATOG is you can kind of chip in for damage here and there. You could also sacrifice a Chromatic Star to your ATOG. Chromatic Star is a artifact that costs 1 colorless mana to play, and it has an activated ability that costs 1 colorless mana, and then you tap and sacrifice Chromatic Star to add 1 mana of any color to your mana pool. However, when Chromatic Star is put into a graveyard from play, you draw a card, and this is available whether you use the ability or not. So you can sacrifice your Chromatic Star to your ATOG, pump the ATOG, and get a cantrip. So that's one other random interaction that's available with ATOG. And the thing about the ATOG is, even without the benefit of flinging it at your opponent or putting Teamer Battle Rage on the ATOG, you can also just have the ever-present threat of alpha striking. If your opponent has no cards in hand or happens to be tapped out, and they don't block the ATOG after they get down to 10 or 12 life, and you've got a bunch of artifacts in play, you're always threatening to sacrifice your artifacts to just kill your opponent on the spot, which means ATOG always has to be blocked. And if they block with a 2/2 creature, it means you can basically just trade your lands that may not be doing much for you in the mid game for their creatures, which is a pretty good trade. So ATOG just brings a lot of value to the table. It's always threatening an alpha strike when it's on the board. Carapace Forger, well, I guess the last thing I should say about ATOG is also because of its ability, it can be tricky to burn off of the board because a bolt on an ATOG means you just sacrifice a land and you've got 4 toughness and the bolt doesn't get the job done. However, if somebody were to drop a Flame Slash on your ATOG to do 4 damage, you'd have to sacrifice 2 permanents, and there's some tricky decision making going on when your opponent does this early in the game, because you don't actually want to sacrifice too many artifacts early in the game sometimes, depending on what your hand looks like. So you got to be careful of that. But at any rate, ATOG is certainly able to dodge smaller burn spells, especially in the mid to late game when you're not as concerned about your lands. Carapace Forger is basically just a 2 mana 4/4 beater. It's Metalcraft. It starts out as a 2/2, but it gets +2/+2 as long as you control 3 or more artifacts. So as long as you have 3 artifacts on board, it goes from a 2/2 to a 4/4. Frogmite's just a 2/2 creature that costs 4 mana but has affinity for artifacts, which means it costs 1 less to cast for each artifact you control. So if you have 4 other artifacts in play, Frogmite casts for free. Gearseeker Serpent is actually 7 mana, but it also basically has affinity. It costs blue, and 5 colorless, so if you have 5 artifacts out, you can just cast it for 2 blue. You're always going to have to pay the 2 blue, as the artifacts in play will only reduce the colorless component of the casting cost. Its activated ability allows it to become unblockable until end of turn, by tapping a blue and 5 colorless, which is pretty pricey, but every once in a while this will come up as a relevant thing. Mirror Enforcer 7 for a 4/4 that has Affinity. So again, if you were to have 5 artifacts in play, you could cast a 4/4 for 2 mana, which is fairly common that play pattern occurs. Galvanic Blast is a 1 red, 2 damage to target creature and player with Metalcraft that allows you to do 4 damage to target creature or player instead if you control 3 or more artifacts. Galvanic Blast is a great, cheap, efficient way to clear off the board to allow your creatures to continue to get in for damage. It's also just a good way to finish the game by going to your opponent's face. Fling we've basically already talked about. The only other nuance to Fling worth mentioning is most of your creatures are fairly beefy on their own. You have a couple of 4/4s and a 5/6. So even without the ATOG, another interesting play that can come up, it's usually not optimal, but sometimes an opponent will play a bit of spot removal on one of your creatures, and in that scenario, in response, you could fling your creature at your opponent or one of your opponent's creatures and sometimes get some value out of a creature that's going to die anyway. Or if your opponent happens to be down to 4 life, you can use Fling as a finisher with pretty much any of your creatures, but Fling is at its best when combined with ATOG. Temur Battle Rage, basically the same story. Putting this on one of your 4/4 creatures means 8 points of damage, so even without an ATOG it can be a deadly instant, but it's at its best when combined with ATOG. Metallic Rebuke is a relatively new inclusion in this deck list. The deck list hadn't really changed a whole lot over the course of time. For the last, I don't know how many sets, quite a few, the deck list has remained mostly the same, but Metallic Rebuke, a couple of copies have worked their way into most lists now. It's a blue and 2 colorless that allows you to counter target spell unless its controller pays 3. However, it has Improvise, which allows you to tap artifacts for 1 colorless mana in the casting cost. Basically, if you've got a couple of chromatic stars on the board, you can actually tap those for mana, and then you can play the Metallic Rebuke for just 1 blue. So typically you've got a random artifact on the board, a Springleaf Drum, a Prophetic Prism, a Flayer Husk, something like that you can utilize in order to basically have a 1 mana leak, which is pretty good. Thoughtcast is 4 colorless mana and 1 blue to draw 2 cards. So it's 5 to draw 2, but it has affinity for artifacts, and a reasonable amount of the time you're drawing 2 cards for 1 mana, which is pretty good. Chromatic Star we've already talked about. Color fixing synergizes a little bit with ATOG, and it cantrips. Flayer Husk is in the deck. Well, basically, before we get to what it's there for, we'll talk about what it is. It's a 1 mana artifact that has a living weapon. It says equipped creature gets +1/+1. The living weapon aspect, it creates a 0/0 black germ token when this artifact comes into play. So basically you get a 1/1 black creature off of the Flayer Husk initially, and then you can pay 2 to equip the Flayer Husk to another creature. The Flayer Husk is in the deck basically because of Edict effects. Chainer's Edict is in a lot of decks out there, and having this Flayer Husk out allows you to dodge an Edict effect and then still get value from the Flayer Husk giving a creature +1/+1. Also, there's a few other 4/4 creatures out there. Denrova Horror is one random example. So being able to throw a Flayer Husk on your 4/4 can certainly make a difference sometimes by being able to get up to that 5/5 point to go over the top of your opponent's creatures. Springleaf Drum is there to help accelerate your deck and mana fix. Playing a Springleaf Drum on turn 1, and then the next turn playing a land, and then tapping one of your lands to drop a Frogmite, and then still having a couple more mana left is a play pattern that you'll see a fair amount of the time when going against Affinity. Prophetic Prism color fixes, accelerates all of your Affinity cards, and also gives you a cantrip. Prophetic Prism just says pay 2 when it comes into play, draw a card, and you can pay 1, tap, and add 1 mana of any color to your mana pool. So this is basically the deck. It's pretty straightforward. It's just an aggressive deck where you're trying to synergize and take advantage of Affinity, the ability to reduce the cost of your creatures for the number of artifacts you have in play, apply consistent pressure, and occasionally just get Alpha Strike wins with ATOG. If your opponent stumbles on mana, you can get some free wins, and if your opponent taps out at an inopportune time and lacks the ability to respond, then an ATOG by itself or combined with a Fling or a Team Real Battle Rage can get you some additional free wins. It's a very powerful and efficient deck. The sideboard includes one copy of Dispel, which allows you to counter an instant spell for 1 blue mana, Electricity, which allows you to pay a red to deal 1 damage to target creature you don't control, or a red and a colorless to deal 1 damage to each of your opponent's creatures. Basically an Armageddon for your opponent's 1/1s. Gorilla Shaman, which allows you to pay 1 and XX to destroy target non-creature artifact with converted mana cost X. It also costs 1 red to cast, and it's a 1/1 creature. Gorilla Shaman exists to destroy artifact lands because you can pay 1 and artifact lands have a casting cost of 0, therefore X is 0, and this basically allows you to spend 4 mana and blow up 4 lands, which is quite powerful. Hydroblast, which allows you to pay 1 blue, counter target spell if it's red, or destroy target permanent if it's red. Krark Clan Shaman, which deals 1 damage to each creature without flying for each artifact that you sacrifice. This does also kill the Krark Clan Shaman when it activates its ability. Natural State, for a green at instant speed, destroy target artifact or enchantment with converted mana cost 3 or less. You got Pyroblast, which is the same as Hydroblast, but the opposite. For red, counter target spell if it's blue, or destroy target permanent if it's blue. You got Relic of Progenitus to exile your opponent's graveyard. Ancient Grudge is a card that allows you to destroy your opponent's artifacts, and it has flashback for extra value. And Serene Heart, which is destroy all local enchantments, or basically destroy all auras and things like that. So to break down the sideboard, Dispel is here for any kind of heavy counterspell deck you might run up against. Dispel is also not terrible in the mirror because being able to dispel a Fling or a Team Real Battle Rage is good. However, finding space for that can be tough, so it may not be something you actually want to bring in there. Electricity is great against anything like elves, fairies, any kind of tokens. Electricity also kills Gorilla Shaman, which is the bane of Affinity decks, because if a Gorilla Shaman stays online, it's going to shut down all of your lands, which is pretty tough, even for an Affinity deck. Hydroblast will kill a Gorilla Shaman, and that's one of the big upsides. Also, Burn can sometimes outrace Affinity, so Dispel and Hydroblast are probably most clearly cards you're going to bring in the Burn matchup. Krark Clan Shaman will kill a Gorilla Shaman, will kill an Elf, won't kill a Fairy, but anything that's all in on a bunch of 1/1s on the ground, some compositions of Stompy, and that kind of thing. Natural State, good against other Affinity decks, and also Natural State is also good against Boggles or any kind of enchantments based deck that's trying to pump a creature up with a bunch of enchantments to get in there for the win. Pyroblast is primarily probably here for heavy aggro or tempo blue decks, just to kind of give you some cheap interaction. Relic is here for any kind of abuse of the graveyard. Most notably, this is going to come in against your Ghostly Flicker style decks, usually Tron, or sometimes there's a white-blue version, white-blue-black versions. I think there might even be a white-blue-green version. So, but anything that's going to abuse Ghostly Flicker, and there's a bunch of other graveyard abuse decks out there at the lower fringes of the meta, but the big one is at the top of the meta is definitely Tron, Ghostly Flicker. Ancient Grudge, again, helps you destroy artifacts. This list is definitely tuned to be able to play well in the mirror match. And then we have Serene Heart, which is, again, it's just good for just really blowing up a Boggles deck or any other deck that's trying to go all in on boosting enchantments on a creature to Alpha Strike with. So that's Affinity. Affinity is let's go ahead and talk about some of these matchups. Affinity's pretty good against Elves because Elves has an explosive, aggressive game plan, but so does Affinity. Elves is going to bring in things like Gleeful Sabotage, and it's going to bring in things like Natural State and stuff like that to blow up your lands quickly, get ahead, and kill you before you can execute your game plan. But once you get to game 2, if you've got a combination of Electrickeries and Krark Clan Shamans, that's really going to hurt your opponent because you can just completely blow them out. And even though they've got Lead the Stampede, there's a reasonable chance you can get ahead and win before they recover. Now, if they happen to, go turn 1 Mana Elf, turn 2 Spider Silk Armor, things are going to get a lot more interesting. So yes, Elves are going to bring in their Spider Silk Armor on after sideboard and Gleeful Sabotage after sideboard as well. So I mean, a lot of it just comes down to if they draw their Gleeful Sabotages and their Spider Silk Armors, and whether or not you hit your cards that are going to blow up their whole army and Electrickery and Krark Clan Shaman. So that's the first thing. Your Galvanic Blasts, you want to be sure and reserve to take out their most significant threats, which basically means Timberwatch Elf and Elvish Vanguard, in my opinion, are the two things you really want to be holding back for. The Lystalana Huntmaster, depending on how the game's unfolding, you do want to kill the Huntmaster, but I don't think it's as high of a priority as the Timberwatch Elf. And it may or may not be as high of a priority as the Elvish Vanguard, just depending on how things are unfolding. The Well-Wisher is something you also want to contain, but it's not as important as the other three. So overall, that's basically how the match is going to unfold. You just want to stay aggressive, and there's really no reason to hold back in the matchup. Against Tron, same thing. You're really trying to get in there, get aggressive, blow your opponent up as best you can. One of the things you got to keep an eye out for is Moment's Peace in this matchup. You might think you've got your opponent on the ropes and you're going in with an ATOG, and even though they're holding up counterspell mana, maybe somehow you happen to know they have a counterspell in their hand. Maybe they revealed it with the Mystical Teachings, and now all they have left is 2 open mana and a prohibit. But you still got to watch out for Moment's Peace if they have 2 mana open and the ability to produce a green, because you Alpha Strike with your ATOG, sack all your permanents, and then they fog you. And that's going to be a problem. Most of these lists with Tron have something like Ancient Grudge or something along those lines. Also a Hydroblast, just a singular Hydroblast, even with just a blue mana open. You go all in with an ATOG, and then they go, sure, and they just, Hydroblast it, or they fling the ATOG at you, and you Hydroblast the fling. So, these are little things you got to keep in mind. Sometimes an interesting play scenario is they hold a blue mana open with the Hydroblast. You go all in with the ATOG, but you're able to hold back a couple of mana, and they Hydroblast the ATOG, and in response you fling it. Stuff like that is basically things to keep an eye out for. But yeah, the big thing is Moment's Peace. These Tron lists usually are running a couple of those in the main board. I think there's probably even a few of these decks that have 3 or maybe even 4 copies in the main. And you just got to try to get in there and kill them before they can assemble their plan, because once they get to the mid game and they can assemble their plan, they're going to definitely lock you out by killing your creatures and using Ghostly Flicker shenanigans. We'll talk about that more in a week or two whenever we finally get around to talking about Tron. So anyway, yeah, basically the matchup's straightforward. Just try to kill your opponent as fast as you can, but watch out for fog effects or Hydroblast or Doomblade or anything that don't beat yourself by sacking everything to an ATOG and getting blown out. Make sure they're tapped down if you're going to Alpha Strike, and just apply continuous steady pressure otherwise. Then after that we've got Mono Blue Delver, and usually with Mono Blue Delver they're gonna be running so they've got some annuls here in the sideboard. This is something you want to keep an eye out for, is their ability counterspell your mirror enforcers and stuff like that for 1 blue. But really, I think for the most part, you're not changing your play style too much. You definitely just want to keep pushing hard. You don't want to allow the fact that they might have a counterspell keep you from cranking out your creatures. The best thing you can do is look for spots where they've only got the ability to counterspell one thing and you can play 3 cards. That's good. You don't want to just play 1 spell a turn and let them counterspell 1 spell every turn. So in those scenarios, you might have to hoard a creature, or I'm sorry, you might have to hoard 2 or 3 creatures before you go in. But generally, you just want to press really hard. This is a tempo race. They're trying to out-tempo you, so you've got to pressure hard. Other than a null, Hydroblast on your ATOG, Curse of Chains on most of your creatures. These are things to keep an eye out for. You got to watch out for days. Because most of these lists, not most, I'm going to say like maybe half of the lists run days. Vapor Snag doesn't really hurt you too badly unless you drop a Temur Battle Rage on an ATOG or you pump an ATOG a lot. Watch out because they can Vapor Snag it. But as for the rest of your creatures, you're just going to be able to redrop them fairly efficiently mana-wise. The deck typically runs on just 4 copies of counterspells, so don't feel like they have infinite counterspells. Again, even when they bring in the annuls, those can only stop your actual artifacts. So particularly your non-artifact creatures, they've only got 4 counterspells. So just keep jamming threats is my advice, and don't let the fact that you could get counterspelled stall you out. Spire Golem doesn't really stop any. I mean, none of their creatures are going to actually stop your threats. The one thing to keep an eye out for is Ninja the Deep Hours. Some of these blue lists have completely cut the ninjas, and some run 1 or 2. I think it makes sense to have 1 or 2 copies in the deck list. It's just too much value to not run it at all. I understand the lists that have gone down in copies because having 2 or 3 ninjas stuck in your hand can be problematic if your opponent is shutting down all your outlets for getting the ninjutsu off. But we'll talk about that also more later when we get to Mono Blue Delver. Basically, as far as targets for your removal, you want to keep an eye out for any ninjas. Be sure that's got to be your top priority to shut that nonsense down. You don't want to let them recycle Spell Stutter Sprites by returning those when they drop a ninja. Otherwise, you just want to kill Delver of Secrets. It's where they're going to get the majority of their damage. Spire Golem is also a reasonably high important threat, but you just want to keep the Spire Golems and the Delvers off the board as much as you can. Spell Stutter Sprites are bad, but they're not going to do as much damage, and you can probably outrace those. So, as far as your sideboard plan against Mono Blue, you're bringing in Electrickery. Also, I like Electrickery better than Krark Clan Shaman. I know Krark Clan Shaman is nice because it's got more range to kill a whole army of opposing 2/2 or 3/3 creatures, but I think Electrickery does the job well enough in most situations. And I'm thinking the Krark Clan Shaman is really a reaction to Elves being able to have sideboard answers to Electrickery. But Electrickery is quite good in the Mono Blue matchup. Other than that, you also have Pyroblast, which is a pretty easy thing to go ahead and jam into your deck list because it's going to answer pretty much anything. Dispel's good, but you have to be careful. And if you do bring in a Dispel, I think the Pyroblast and the Electrickery are very solid, and so is Dispel. But all of these you have to be careful to watch out for a Spell Stutter Sprite coming down. Spell Stutter Sprite is a blue and a colorless, and when it comes into play, it says counter target spell with converted mana cost X or less, where X is the number of fairies you control. And with just the Spell Stutter Sprite in play, which is a fairy, that means they can counterspell a 1 mana cost spell. So you just have to watch out, because if you play something like a Pyroblast and you don't have any other backups to that, and they play a Spell Stutter Sprite, then they're going to eat your Pyroblast and get a 1/1 flyer to boot. So if you can back that up with a Galvanic Blast, that is ideal. Against Burn, you're basically looking to bring in your Dispel, and your Hydroblasts. And that's basically it from this type of a sideboard. Some of these sideboard lists will run feed the clan, which is a green and a colorless. That says you gain 5 life. It says you gain 10 life instead if you control a creature with power 4 or greater. So I know depending on how much you're concerned about burn, that's an additional sideboard option that some lists will run from time to time to help deal with burn. Otherwise, it's just a damage race. You also have the Metallic Rebukes, and you've got bigger, more explosive Alpha Strikes and Temur Battle Rage Fling and the ATOG plan. But the Dispel and the Hydroblasts are quite good. What you have to watch out for from burn, aside from its normal shenanigans, is Smash to Smithereens is probably the best thing that they've got. Martyr of Ashes they might or might not bring in. They really have to kind of play a very wonky game plan because they've got to hoard a bunch of red cards. And if you know that there's a chance they might be trying to do something with Martyr of Ashes, you can just be careful not to deploy your whole board. I mean, a couple of 4/4 beaters are going to do a lot of work, and if they're sandbagging spells for a couple of turns extra, you're going to just so they can get a 2-for-1. That's really not great considering the amount of tempo you'll get out of that. But yeah, otherwise, Smash the Smithereens is definitely their best card they can bring in, which is a red and a colorless that says deal 3 damage, or destroy target artifact and deal 3 damage to that artifact controller. And sometimes they'll bring in Molten Rain if they have it. Just depends, I guess, on their style and what they're trying to do. Just try to blow up your land, slow you down. Molten Rain's red, colorless, destroy target land. If that land was non-basic, Molten Rain deals 2 damage to that land's controller. So it's basically just a damage race. And the interesting thing to note here is a lot of these spells don't do 4 damage. So you've got Fire Blast, which is 6 mana to do 4 damage to a creature or player, or sacrifice 2 mana to play the spell for free, basically. But once you get past Fire Blast, there's Rift Bolt, Searing Blaze, Magma Jet, Shard Volley, Lightning Bolt, and Chain Lightning. Now, when you combine any of those with not any of those, but when you combine most of those with a Needle Drop, you can get to 4 damage. But they don't. Burn doesn't. The thing about burn is burn kind of has 2 different levels it's playing at. A lot of times burn's just trying to burn you out. But the other thing that burn can do is it can pivot and play a semi-control game against certain creature-based deck lists that operate on smaller creatures. And say against like an aggro green or white weenie deck, red has the option to try to pivot, blow up creatures, get a Thermo Alchemist or a Firebrand Archer out there, and maybe a Curse of the Pierced Heart, and just slowly grind out a win. Well, not even that slowly, but more slowly grind out a win off of its creatures and Curse of the Pierced Heart. Curse of the Pierced Heart is an enchantment where you enchant a player and it does 1 damage to them during their upkeep. So that gives the red deck some inevitability, and then Firebrand Archer deals a damage to an opponent whenever you play an instant or sorcery. So if you have Firebrand Archer out and you bolt their creature off, even if you can't get in for an attack with the Firebrand Archer, every time you play a removal spell, you're removing their creature and doing a point of damage. And then Thermo Alchemist deals 1 damage to each opponent, and then it untaps whenever you play an instant or sorcery. It's a 2 mana 0/3 creature, so it allows you to ping your opponent down every turn and then get an extra ping whenever you play a burn spell. So red can sort of pivot and try to play more of a control game plan, but it can't do that against the Affinity deck list very well because Affinity's creatures are big. They could possibly, sacrificing a ton of artifacts to protect your ATOG may not be worth it, so they might be able to nuke your ATOG. But your Carapace Forger, your Gear Seeker Serpent, your Mirror Enforcer, these are 4/4s and a 5/6. Frogmite is a 2/2. And then once you put a Flayer Husk on top of, these creatures like the Mirror Enforcer or the Carapace Forger, now even combining a 3 damage spell with the extra ping in from from needle drop won't even get the job done. So it's basically a damage race. You want to bring in whatever counter spells and life gain you have available, and that's basically the matchup. Izzet Delver is a situation where you want to really prioritize your spot removal to kill their ninjas or anything where you think that they might be about to ninjutsu in. I guess I'll go ahead and mention ninja here as Ninja of the Deep Hours. It's a blue and 3 colorless for a 2/2 creature, or you can ninjutsu a ninja in for blue and a colorless, which allows you. Ninjutsu is an ability where you return an unblocked attacker and you put the ninja into play and return the unblocked attacker to your hand. So if you attack with a Delver of Secrets and the Delver's not blocked, then you can deploy the Ninja of the Deep Hours from your hand for 2 mana. The ninja's attacking just like the Delver was, only now the Delver goes back to your hand and you have a 2/2 creature that is attacking, and they've already passed their declare blocker step, so it can't be blocked. And you get in for 2 damage unless they use removal at that point, and whenever the Ninja of the Deep Hours does damage to a player, then it triggers a card draw ability. So one of the really, well, we'll break down Izzet Delver in the future as well, but the key here is you really want to prioritize shutting down ninja. That's the whole deck, not the whole deck, but a huge component of the deck is if it can get a ninja out and keep it online for several turns, it gets harder and harder to win that game. So you definitely want to prioritize shutting down a ninja. You also want to keep in mind the sideboard probably has Hydroblasts and Pyroblasts coming out, as well as possibly Dispels or Negates, and also possibly Gorilla Shamans. So these are just all things, and then also possibly Swirling Sandstorm, which is a red and 3 colorless to do 5 damage to all creatures without flying, as long as you have Threshold when you cast it. So this is a deck that has a lot of reactionary slots in the sideboard available to it, and it has several flyers with Delver of Secrets, Fairy Miscreant, and Spellstarter Sprite. So in addition to trying to get value out of the ninja, it's trying to tempo you in the air. It follows a somewhat similar game plan to mono blue aggro / control. So it's just a matter of out-tempoing them. If you can keep their Delver and their ninja under control, then you stand a reasonable chance. In your sideboard, you're going to want to bring in your Electrickery. You're going to want to bring in Hydroblast as well. And then from there, you may want to bring in Pyroblast, just because it's going to be good against their ninja, against their it's good against their counterspells, their ninjas, their Delvers, and all that stuff. So Hydroblast, I guess. Let me back up here. You don't bring in Hydroblast to stop their main deck red cards, because in their main deck they just have removal cards that you're not terribly worried about. The reason you would bring in a Hydroblast would be to actually proactively fight back against their Pyroblasts that they're going to bring in. But this isn't necessarily important to do until you get to game 3, and then you can assess if you think it's really worth it or not. Their Pyroblast will shut down your Gearseeker Serpent, along with potentially any of your counterspell options that you have. And that's really all you care about, is how much of a counterspell war develops and that kind of a thing. But definitely the one that you will definitely bring in is Pyroblast, just because it's good against a lot of their actual threats. That's not a question mark, that's a definite. So in summary, you're bringing in the Electrickery for sure, along with the Pyroblast. Other things you might bring in would include basically like maybe Hydroblast, maybe Dispel. Stompy matchup. This is a deck that's probably got Gleeful Sabotage. It might even have other additional artifact destroying spells in the sideboard. Epic Confrontation is fairly common as well. This is just a straight beater deck that's going to try to pump with Rancor, Elephant Guide, Hunger of the Howlpack, and Vines of Vastwood. You definitely want to kill Vault Scourge, because if they can pump up with Elephant Guide and be getting in 4 points of lifelink every turn, that's a big problem. So that's the main thing. The other thing is you got to watch out with the timing for your removal, because Hunger of the Howlpack is a very powerful, permanent +3/+3, like giant growth on steroids. It's basically a race. You've got to know, like any other aggro v aggro matchup, you've got to know when you're in the driver's seat and when you got to slow things down and defend. You have kind of a better long game in the sense that you can just win the game on the spot with a fling. And generally a teamer battle rage, though they could have something like a moment's peace in the sideboard. You got to keep that in mind for post sideboard games. But it's basically just an aggressive race. The kind of things you're going to bring in against Stompy, Cart Clan Shamans, if you have them, are quite good. Electrickery is okay. It's kind of medium because they do have a lot of 2/2 creatures. Those are basically a lot of. I mean, you really don't even have to sideboard at all in this particular matchup. A lot of your deck is already tuned pretty well to just go to the face, and you just want to get there better than them. Inside Out combo. This is taking advantage of Tireless Tribe and Inside Out comboing together to do lethal in one shot. And basically they're spending every turn trying to dig for cards. So if you can hold back some cards to kill the Tireless Tribe, just to kind of give them some trouble. You don't necessarily want to throw burn spells at the Tireless Tribe early on because they'll just chunk cards to easily defend it. But if you can have the option to hold up a red mana at the end to try to hit it when they try to combo off. Once they switch the power and toughness, it's only going to have one toughness. But, they have a lot of answers. They've got Dispel, they've got Giga Drouse, they've got Circular Logic. So, that may not be there, but you still got to keep it in mind. And if you can apply enough pressure early to force them to all in with the Tireless Tribe before they've got backup ready, you might even be able to kill the Tireless Tribe with a burn spell when they finally go all in. But basically, this is another scenario where you're just trying to jam as much damage as quickly as possible. They do have Standard Bearer in the sideboard, so I mean, I don't know if they're actually going to bring it in. I mean, you've got Teamer Battle Rage, but a lot of their cards, you have Echoing Truth on an ATOG with Teamer Battle Rage is another thing to watch out for. Hydroblast, blowing up your Fling, your ATOG. Hydroblast is probably their biggest card they have as an option to cause you trouble. As far as your sideboard plan, you're going to want to bring in basically your Pyroblasts and maybe your Dispel if you have something, if you're running the same sideboard package as the stock Affinity list. Against, I think that pretty well covers the main portion of the metagame. Video is getting a little bit long here, but I'll just say against mono black, you just want to apply pressure as fast as you can, because if black manages to survive into the mid game, you're going to have a very tough time defeating them. Things like Chittering Rats getting value, Crypt Rats, once they get the 4 black mana, they can blow up almost all of your creatures. They've also got Gurmag Angler to tangle with you, some lists run that. Chainer's Edict, Geth's Verdicts, and Victim of Night mean that they can basically just off all of your creatures. Tendrils of Corruption can kill most of your creatures once they get to 4 swamps. Same thing goes for Pestilence. And it doesn't get much better once we go to sideboard, because they're going to get usually access to more hard removal, Unmake, Doom Blades, Diabolic Edicts, stuff like that. They also have Duress here on this sideboard to cause you some disruption. Against mono black, really, maybe Relic of Progenitus if they have any graveyard shenanigans going on. Maybe a Dispel to try to kill some of their, just fight back against some of their removal. Other than that, this is where Reaping the Graves comes in as a nice bring in. Kuldotha Boros. Basically, depending on what version you're going against, the stock Kuldotha Boros list, your best thing that you've got going for you is your Electrickery, While the deck does have some artifacts and some artifact lands, bringing in your artifact hate may not be the absolute best. If you bring in a Gorilla Shaman, it's going to get blown off very quickly, and blowing up one or two of their lands isn't necessarily going to do a whole lot for you. So, Hydroblast, Dispel, these things work to fight back against the removal if you think it's necessary. Or I'm sorry, Pyroblast. Hydroblast. And then, Ancient Grudge is a more targeted option you could run if you really want to fight against them. But your main deck is fairly well tuned. The one card you definitely want to bring in is Electrickery. A lot of their 1/1 tokens will also be flyers, so Kark Clan Shaman is pretty questionable. Electrickery is quite good here, though. Another reason why I like Electrickery. But hey, pretty much everybody does. We'll just cover this. This will be the last deck we cover here. So we've got mono white, heroic. I don't know exactly what else they might be calling this thing, but it basically operates off of Laguna Band Trailblazer, Akroan Skyguard, and Seeker of the Way. They want to throw spells in the direction of the Akroan Skyguard and Laguna Band Trailblazer and have Seeker of the Way just get the benefits of spells being cast in general. It's going to try to, pump up a Laguna Band Trailblazer or an Akroan Skyguard or both while going in with a Seeker of the Way, taking advantage of Defiant Strike's cantripping, and then Emerge Unscathed being able to give protection. The thing to note about Emerge Unscathed in this matchup is it gives protection from a color, but it can't give protection from an artifact. They also have Mutagenic Growth, Cartouche of Solidarity, Ethereal Armor, Hyena Umbra, Chomana's Blessing. So they've got a lot of this stuff going on. What you want to do is you want to apply pressure quickly and get them in a position, if possible, where they're having to throw, a reactionary Defiant Strike on one of their creatures, or a Chomana's Blessing, and you're able to get a 2-for-1 by dropping Galvanic Blast. Electrickery is not really that great in the matchup, just because there's not a whole lot. You gotta realize they've basically only got one target that you're going to be able to take advantage of, which is the Akroan Skyguard, and it's going to grow large too quickly. So it's basically just a race. You're trying to just get in and kill them as quickly as you can. They've got Dust to Dust that they can bring in out of the sideboard, which is the biggest thing you've got to watch out for. Along with some of these lists are running Fragmentize as well. So the matchup can definitely be a little bit tricky and can give some difficulty. You basically just want to apply pressure as hard as you can. Be very careful with how you utilize your removal, because if you try to do it proactively and they have mana open, Chomana's Blessing, Emerge Unscathed, Mutagenic Growth, they have a lot of answers to be able to interact with your proactive removal. But if you can apply pressure and get them reacting to you, then you can get some value out of your removal. Again, you're just trying to press in hard, keep them from gaining too much life off of Seeker of the Way, hopefully, and then, try to get lucky and Alpha Strike with an ATOG. Anyway, that's all for now, guys. Leave a comment if there's a particular deck you want reviewed, and we'll probably take up Tron next week if I don't hear anything different in the comments. Peace.